timer started, and we can go ahead and continue. Now, I know the last choice we made was a green one. The reality is I'm not really going into this with like a particular preferred ending, so it's one of the reasons why we've generally just sort of flipped back and forth between red and green. Let's do another green. Her sudden closeness flustered me. The sweet smell of shampoo that came floating from her hair tickled my nose, and I knew my face was getting flushed with heat. A deal? She wore a terribly serious expression as she watched me. My breath caught in my throat. In return, she would... do what? Her cheeks blushing with a trace of embarrassment, Rimi whispered to me as though she'd made up her mind. When I comprehended her meaning, I lost my composure. I couldn't tell if she were joking or being serious. For the moment, I began to look away from her, but before I could, she... Rimi cast a brief glance at our surroundings and pressed down on my shoulders. Perplexed, I obeyed her. Hugging my knees, I leaned up against the shelf of CDs. As I puzzled over her intentions, Rimi crouched in front of me. So she wanted me to sit directly on the floor? I didn't want to act that much like a delinquent, but Rimi grasped my calves and forced my knees to unbend. I couldn't stop myself from sliding down, legs thrown out in front of me. Suddenly, Rimi straddled my legs. Rimi laid her pointer finger across my lips. She was telling me to keep quiet. But doing this kind of thing in the middle of the store? Rimi looked down at me bashfully as though she'd read my mind. So long as you don't make too much noise. So what about it? Rimi's face came even closer to mine. Her breath tickled my cheek. A hot sigh. I was too captivated to look away from Rimi's ardent eyes. Her gaze seemed to draw me in. Rimi looked directly back at me. Still looking, she began moving her hands alone, undoing the buttons on my blazer one by one. Rimi reached for her necktie without answering, pulling me toward her as she loosened it. She moved down to undo my shirt buttons as well. Her slim hands, bellying her words, slipped past my bare chest and into my shirt. Her cool hand slid leisurely across my skin. A bewitching smile. I felt a pang in my chest as the sight of her expression. She was normally so bright and cheerful and gave off little in the way of a sexual atmosphere. I'm pretty sure most people's hearts would be pounding in a situation like this. Ah, crap. I blurted out exactly what I was thinking. That alone was enough to unsettle me. I feel like you should be able to piece that together yourself. Clearly you're just wanting us to explain something you already know. It means you're amazingly hot. I don't know if hot's the word I would use, because ero is typically associated with erotic. And hot, I think, is just a little bit too low down. If you were to, like, tier it of, like, cute, hot, sexy, hot, I think, is a little too low to really be an equivalent to uber ero. The tips of Rimi's fingers caressed the sides of my neck, crawling over my skin. It tickled, and it felt amazing. Maybe not. Maybe don't do it in the middle of a store. You know, you can do a whole hell of a lot more if you don't do it in the middle of a fucking store. Guided by instinct, I nodded vigorously. No? How about no?
No.
I doubted my ears. Do it here? Did that mean...
何を
Okay, so it would have only been like another 5 minutes if I had let that run. Last part, but I didn't because I wasn't quite sure exactly how long that delusion was going to be. I abruptly came back to myself. Rimi was waving her hand in front of my face, eyebrows knitted in wonderment. I wasn't sitting on the floor, and she wasn't straddling my legs. We were simply standing normally, facing one another. And 1 second, I need to pause it. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. I had to take care of a spam message that was gonna bug the shit out of me.
でもない。
落ち着け。
I leapt away from Rimi, turned my back on her, and took deep breaths. I'd had an arrow delusion. I was indeed the lowest of the low. I became quite disgruntled with myself. No, it was also Rimi's fault for talking about repaying me. Any male would start imagining stuff if he had heard such a suggestive, sexy line. Come to think of it, how did she intend to repay me after all?
その調子だと話聞いてなかったでしょう。
Of course not.
じゃあもう一回言うけど、私のお気に入り CD を貸すっていうので手を打ってくれないかな。
I don't think we have a common interest in music in any way.
は？
ねえねえ、いいでしょ？お願いします。この通り。
What? Well, that's reality for you. Speaking of which, why had I fantasized about things ending up that way with Rimi anyway? I wasn't supposed to be interested in 3D girls. When I nodded right away in answer to Rimi's suggestion, she struck a joyful victory pose. It was so funny looking that I found myself smiling despite the danger of the situation. Somehow, we made it back to my base without any incident. It was all thanks to Rimi, of course. I owed her one. But I was a tad put off by how she instantly rejected my request to wait outside while I tidied up my room a little.
だって前に来た時に汚いっていうのはよーくわかったし、今さら片付けたって無駄だよ。
But there is a point in it, you know. If our opinion of you changed in such a way that, you know, we don't want you to see us in a bad light anymore, we would make a point of wanting you to see our home, if you can call it that, being clean rather than being a mess.
かっこつけなくてもいいって。私とタクの中でしょ？ね？
What kind of pals? Rimi was absent from my memory, and so I didn't really know. Once in a while, I was startled by Rimi's familiarity toward me. It wasn't at all unpleasant, but there were definitely discrepancies in the sense of distance we each felt between each other. For that matter, I wondered if Rimi was serious about it being okay not to clean up my room. Even though convenience store lunchboxes I'd finished eating were scattered on the floor along with utensils, and eroge boxes with sensationalistic illustrations on them were piled up on the bed, either Rimi wasn't the sensitive sort, or she didn't perceive me to be any kind of threat. Both prospects left me feeling kind of ambiguous. Appearing not to notice any of my distress, Rimi sat on the sofa and earnestly looked down at the lyrics booklet that had been included with Phasma's CD. Or Phantasms. I dropped heavily into my computer chair. I made the tension leave my body. My nerves had worn thin from cowering in fear the whole day, but maybe the reason I didn't feel all that exhausted was because Rimi was here with me.
さて、どうしよっか。
Rimi closed the lyrics booklet, stretched grandly, and sent a smile my way. What to do, she'd asked. What was I supposed to do? Rimi hadn't come here to hang out in the first place. Her original aim had been to borrow my CD. If she were going to do me a favor of staying here with me, how should I respond? Did I even have to do anything to begin with? If this were an eroge, we'd jump right into an H scene, but... Crappity crap. I better not think about that sort of thing right now. Even under the best of circumstances, I would still feel very strained being alone in my room with a 3D girl. If I let my imagination run away with me unnecessarily, I'd become overly cautious of her and might do something weird to give myself away. Silence. Rimi gazed vaguely at the manga volumes scattered on the floor and the eroge stacked on the bed. So awkward. I had the sense that I ought to start a conversation, but I couldn't think of any potential topics except games or anime. I didn't think she would know much about them. Anyway, she'd said she would be there for me, so maybe she would spare me and start talking first. I'd be in trouble if she'd expect me to take the conversational lead. I didn't know how to handle 3D girls, after all. I was grateful to her for staying with me, but I wouldn't be able to hold up under the pressure of this silence. The dimness of my room was also part of the issue. It gave me the hallucination that there was something lewd in the air between us. Unable to keep still, I turned my face to my PC. There was something I had to look up. I thought of it earlier at school, something that might be a hint about how to come into possession of a D-sword. Is it possible to change your imagined visions into actual images? Using the things Senna had told me about VR technology and how humans are electrical devices as a springboard, I began probing into the matter.
何してるの?
Rimi stood up and approached me. Should I explain? But how best to explain it to her? Or what a hassle.
ねえねえ、何してるか教えてよ。
When I didn't react, Rimi started poking me in the back with her finger. I certainly couldn't ignore her, could I?
君は妄想が現実になるって信じられる?
As I entered search keywords into my browser, I spoke without looking over at Rimi. In fact, it seemed more like I was addressing Sarah.
妄想が現実に? 無理でしょう。もしそれができたら、人はとっくに万能になってるよ。
Omnipotent. Huh. That very well might be the case. Delusions were a world where even the most unrealistic things became possible. If they became reality, it would mean making the unreal into something real.
それがどうしたの?
それに近いシステムがアメリカで特許あるんだ。
へえ、冗談でしょ。
I sensed Rimi letting out an exasperated sigh behind me. In answer, I opened the aforementioned patent image I had received from Shiho. Of course, it should also be noted that just because somebody makes a patent for something doesn't mean it actually exists. There are numerous instances of hardware companies patenting things and then they just never actually come to fruition.
特許の証拠写真?
Yes, proof of a patent. The device may not actually exist. Of course, we've had some scenes that would seem to indicate otherwise, but generally speaking, just because there's a patent doesn't mean it actually exists. It just means somebody came up with an idea of how to accomplish something.
本当に?
Leaning forward, Rimi brought her face nearer to the monitor. She ended up peering into it from very close behind me.
私英語って苦手。
How are you terrible at English? I mean, so we're in high school. I mean, I don't know like when English starts being taught in Japanese schools, but I would assume, you know, she'd probably have started, I don't know, middle school at the absolute latest. So presumably she'd have gone through a number of years now of English. You know, it may not be able to get some of the bigger words potentially, but, you know, you'd probably be able to do a conversation at least and be able to grasp a number of the concepts included here.
すごいね、タク。英語読めるなんて。
So close. She was so near me, I could see the reflection of the monitor sparkling in her eyes. I was starting to get flurried again.
ねえねえ、どういうことか教えてよ。
Well, you're not looking at her eyes, so you wouldn't see the reflection of the monitor in her eyes. You would see the reflection of her eyes in the monitor, depending upon, you know, how reflective your monitor's screen actually is, which this is an old CRT. So typically those aren't really reflective if they're turned on. Apparently it had drawn her interest. Did I read? Yes, okay. The last line was a red line. Or a voiced line, rather. Doing my best not to think about how close she was, I focused on looking back and forth between my monitor and Sarah.
生まれながらに盲目の人でもビデオカメラみたいな映像機器を通すことでそこに映る景色が見えるようになるんだ。これ豆知識な。
ビデオカメラが目の代わりっていうこと？
Which, I believe it's quite a bit older, but I believe that is something that people had actually looked into for a similar sort of idea.
そう。VR 技術って言うんだよ。
へえ。もし本当だったらすごいな。
I'm telling you, it is real. Senna had said the tests were successful.
でも。
But for all you know, Senna is just, you know, lying. She doesn't actually know that. For all you know. You know. The reality is, for all we know, everybody is... A bunch of the people we've interacted with are straight up actually delusional. And just, you know, we're also... us also being delusional results in us, you know, filling in some things to, you know, make the delusion seem more, I don't know what would be the best way to describe it. I think you all are somewhat grasping what I'm trying to get at, but not completely, because I'm not quite sure how best to explain it, to be honest, in this case. But either way, for all we know, everybody's delusional. Our main character, Senna, Fess, all these people we interact with, everyone's delusional in some way. And we use these delusions to fill in blanks that better fit what we think is actually happening. And so, you know, test may not have actually been successful, but, you know, Senna saw something and she's like, oh yes, this works great for my delusions. You know, and then she proceeds to spread it to our main character, who's like, oh yes, of course.
機械を使って目が見えるようになるのと妄想が現実になるってどうつながるの？私、頭悪いからよくわかんないや。
Basically, everybody in this story is, in some way, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. While explaining to Remy, I played around with likely sounding search keywords using trial and error, but I couldn't find the sort of page I'd been looking for. Even so, I persisted in inputting more new keywords.
映像機器に映る景色も脳内で思い浮かべた妄想も電気信号だから。逆に考えるんだ。脳内に電気信号を送るんじゃなくて、脳内から電気信号を送るって考えるんだ。
ほほう。
Ambiguous answers were all that came back to me. Maybe she didn't understand very well. It'd be a bother to explain in greater detail, so I gave up on talking about it. I concentrated instead on looking things up. Well, it wasn't like I needed her to understand, because in the end, it was nothing more than my own deductions. Rimi went on nodding and making noises of assent all on her own. I figured I would leave her be. I'd run a variety of searches, but I couldn't find any documents verifying my line of reasoning. Deciding to alter my approach a little, I began running searches emphasizing the patent-related aspects of it. I went to a foreign wiki site that Shiho had told me about, one all about American patents. I began searching to see if there were any patents similar to what I had in mind. As I jumped from link to link, I finally found an image similar in atmosphere to the one Shiho had passed on to me before. It appeared to be a different patent document than the one about the VR equipment. I swiftly skimmed the contents.
神経信号パルスを遠隔地からモニターし、それを映像および音声として再現する装置と方法。
おお。
Shut up, Rimi. It was exactly what I've been thinking of. I unthinkingly hovered out of my chair.
これすごいぞ。
すごいの？何が何が？
簡単に言うとこれ他人の思考を盗撮する技術だ。
思考を盗撮。
In short, it meant you could use special machinery to spy on the sounds and images people thought of in their heads. On top of that, it said the neural pulse monitoring could be performed via satellite that would make it possible to film the thoughts of everyone on the planet.
本当にそんなことできるの？ SF 小説とかそういう類のものなんじゃ？
You would presumably require a fairly decent number of satellites to be able to do this with everybody on the planet. Certainly if you wanted to do it at the same time or within a fairly short time span.
特許ってそのシステム自体が完全に仕上がってないと絶対に取得できないんだって。
So it had said when I looked up patents online.
だからこれもちゃんとシステムが確立されてるってことだよ。
This wasn't fiction. With enough money and technological power to construct the system, it could be made into reality at any time. This is what Senna had told me.
ある意図的な情報を神経パルスへコンバートすることが可能なら、人の五感すべて、さらには人の意志そのものもコントロールできるんじゃないか。
There had been no source for that theory, so ultimately it amounted to no more than Senna's deductive reasoning. But a source had emerged for the theory I thought of. I wondered why such an amazing news story remained totally unknown in Japan. Well, for one, it's an patent with the US Patent Office. Office, excuse me. So, unless it's a normal thing for Japanese media to cover US patents, of course it would more than likely remain unknown in Japan. Frankly, it seemed Nobel Prize worthy to me. I went on to run a search for the words thought recording. What came up were the records from an American lawsuit.
また英文だ。
Oh my god.
頭痛くなってきそうだよ。
It's okay, well, it's nice to know that Rimi is apparently a bit of an airhead. Which then also begs the question how she managed to get into a private high school. It was fairly long, so it looked like I'd have a pretty hard time reading it as well. The phrasing might get kind of weird, but I used an automatic translator to convert it to Japanese. The contents were, in sum, something along the lines of the following. Lawsuit brief. Plaintiff N.K. Rabin, defendant, the United States Department of Defense Central Intelligence Bureau. The plaintiff's claims: my thoughts have been spied on by means of a special device recorded and broadcast to an unknown destination via satellite. These satellites have taken me hostage day and night without end. Numerous satellites constantly assault me. 1. Tracking. 2. Observation. 3. Full body surveillance. 4. Biorhythmical attacks. 5. Oral attacks. 6. Physical debilitation. Since the latter part of December 1990, I have been forced to view man-made dreams, including both visual and oral components, as I sleep. From February to May 1992, I underwent biorhythmical assault, pain, torture, harassment. Recognizing this as an attack against me, I began recording the following items and notes beginning in February 1992. Date, time, the contents of particularly agonizing psychological attacks. Biorhythmical attacks were carried out against every part of my body. All those portions of my body were adjusted to best receive the unpleasantness, exhaustion, and suffering induced by pain, torture, and harassment. The main regions are listed below: chest, vision, lower abdomen, brain to interfere with my sleep, brain to show me artificial dreams.
思考監視、思考盗撮、しかも国家ぐるみ。
Or the guy's a nut job.
マジ？
あ、私これ知ってる。何年か前に映画で見た。
That's fiction. But the brief written here wasn't. There were two possibilities. The plaintiff was merely a mental patient, or the whole thing was fact. Generally speaking, most people are going to lean more towards mental patient. It was difficult to discern the boundary between the two. It seemed as though it could be truthful considering the patent I'd seen earlier, but again, patents don't necessarily mean it actually exists. But Senna and Ayase weren't mentally ill, especially Ayase. Are you sure about that? Because they very well could be, and you don't know that they're mentally ill because you yourself also are, and so you don't see it in them. At the time, Ayase had become two people before my very eyes. I hadn't witnessed the second when she became like that, but when I turned around, another Ayase was there, and in a school swimsuit to boot. She had shown me how she pulled her D-sword out of thin air as well. It hadn't been an illusion or a delusion. Again, how do you know that? Could be a case of, again, she says she's going to pull out her D-sword, and so you have a delusion of her actually doing it. That way, it fills your delusions. Once she showed me something like that, I couldn't say she was simply sick in the head anymore, and again, not quite true. Only Ayase had told me the following. Exactly. You're both delusional is a very real possibility. That mysterious phenomenon really had been. Was it truly the result of what I'd envisioned? Right beforehand, admittedly, I had been thinking about how moe it would be if Ayase wore a school swimsuit. AKA, that are only visible to those who are delusional is a possibility yet again. I am very much willing to poke holes in stories. I realize that this is just a story, but nonetheless, I am the kind of person who will often poke holes in them. If only just because, to critique the way they go about telling the story. Was this what she had been referring to when she mentioned the power? The power to project delusions into reality? Perhaps I possessed it. No. I was getting way ahead of myself here. It was too much of a leap to assume such a supernatural power existed simply because there was a system capable of scientifically replaying delusions on film, and again, just because there's a patent doesn't mean it exists. Okay. we are approaching the 30-minute mark. In fact, as I'm saying that, we are basically going to approach it once I finish talking in a second. But if the first one is anything to go by, this is probably, well, this has the potential to be a fairly short delusion. So, yeah. Now, we've done 2 greens back to back, so let's mix it up a little and do a red again. Except, what if the way to come into possession of a D sword required precisely that sort of supernatural power? And if I bore such a power within me, it might very well be worth a try. Leaving Rimi to gaze at the monitor, her eyebrows furrowed, I picked up the toy D-sword propped up in the corner of my room. I stood in the center of the room and held it up at eye level, just like an ESO character. At this point, I started to feel rather comical. It was practically impossible for a scrawny Japanese guy like me to look cool carrying such a big sword. It didn't look like it was actually that big of a sword, to be honest. You saw it online a lot in pictures of cosplay events and such, but pretty much all of them are painful to look at. Now I must be in much the same state. This might be asking the impossible. Even as I thought that in a corner of my head, I figured I would give it a shot for the time being. I guess all I have to do is picture a sword in my head. When I thought of a sword, I inevitably ended up basing it on the ones that appear in ESO. Or else, maybe it would be better to go with a sword like the one Senna and Ayase possessed, lovely, ominous, and sharp enough to sever anything at a single touch. I couldn't envision the whole thing clearly, because I was still a little lost. I couldn't decide whether to narrow it down to an ESO sword or one like Senna and Ayase's sword. Between the two, I'd probably have to be the latter. Okay, I'll forge ahead, assuming the worst. I replayed the picture in my head, gritting my molars and clenched the sword in both hands. I prayed hard. Become real. Something soft and warm covered my hands as they gripped the sword. My heart jolted and I opened my eyes. Rimi, extending a hand from where she stood beside me, had seized my wrist. She hung her head, and her eyebrows were furrowed painfully, and her lips trembled faintly. What? She seemed strange. Like a different person from when she had tilted her head upon hearing what I had to say about the patent. Besides, what did she mean by stop? Unpleasant memories grazed the back of my brain. Rimi was my ally. She was supposed to be. But that didn't mean I'd solved every one of her mysteries. Did Rimi know something about D-swords? I swallowed convulsively and began timidly speaking to her.
Taku.
Her gaze fixed in place, Rimi opened her mouth. She spoke in a stifled voice, one empty of all emotion.
その件だけど。
Rimi was my ally, right? She wouldn't betray me like Yua, would she? If Rimi betrayed me,
捨てた方がいいと思う。
どうして
My voice came close to cracking. Had I been right to think Rimi knew something?
だって。
Finally shifting her line of sight, Rimi met my gaze straight from the front. I hastily averted my eyes. After all, what? What are you saying?
だって、もう高校生だし。
Without warning, Rimi's face broke into a mischievous smile. The suddenness of her transformation took the wind out of my sails.
そりゃ、男の子っていくつになってもそういうおもちゃが大好きなんだなーってのはなんとなくわかるけど、さすがにそんな大きなおもちゃ一人で部屋で振り回してるのはどうかと思うよ。
Again, from what we saw, it did not look like a particularly big sword. It really didn't.
それが許されるのは小学生までじゃない？でも、タクの個人的な趣味を私の前で披露してくれたってのはちょっと嬉しいかも。
We were trying no such thing, Rimi. We were trying no such thing.
私にだけ秘密を教えてくれたみたいで。
You just happened to be here when we decided, hey, this is our opportunity to try doing this thing. I mean, I'm a little shocked we didn't, try to force her out and then do it when she's no longer here. But hey, story. I mean, we're talking about a character who is uncomfortable around 3D girls, and really just 3D people in general, I would say. And yet he decided to do this thing that he presumably already knew was going to be very cringy and embarrassing. And he did it when there was a real-life person, from his perspective, of course, and especially a girl, right there in the same room as him. It is a little bit shocking that, like I said, we didn't just tell her, hey, Remy, I think it's time for you to go, or something like that, to try and get her out before we did the thing that was going to be cringy and embarrassing. What's with that? I'd gotten freaked out for no reason.
そもそもそれ、どこで買ってきたの？高かったんじゃない？
1万円、渋谷の雑貨屋で。
And what, 10,000 yen is what, like 100 or something bucks? I'm curious about that, actually. I think that sounds about right, because I think sort of the basic conversion is typically you drop 2 zeros. It's not 100% accurate, but it tends to be, fairly close. Yeah, 10,000 Japanese yen, according to Google right now, is $91.24 when you convert it to USD. So, like I said, a basic conversion is typically often to just drop 2 zeros. So, a little under $100.
へえ、1万円か。安いのか高いのかわからないけど。でもそんな大きなおもちゃが普通に売ってるんだね。私、そんな大きなのを直接見たのって初めて。
I would say it's cheap. It doesn't matter what the quality of the sword is. Effectively $100 is pretty cheap, I imagine.
その雑貨屋さんに売ってるっていうのは誰かに教えてもらったの？
She seemed unwilling to let the topic go. Was she interested in this sort of sword? Maybe Remy was secretly into grand-seeming make-believe stuff too. While teasing me a little for owning the sword, did she in truth desperately long for one of her own? LOL, that's so tsundere.
自分で調べた。ネットで。
ネットか。すごいな。何でも情報が手に入るんだね。私は全然ダメ。パソコンなんてろくに使えないよ。
Also, assuming Remy actually knows us in any real capacity, she would know we don't really know very many people. So it's highly unlikely that anybody would have told us that they were selling this sword at this particular variety store in Shibuya.
で、その剣って流行ってるの？
Nope.
なんで？
Our character's just crazy.
タクはどうしてそれを買おうと思ったのかなって。
Because we're crazy. And it had a name that fit something that we're looking for. Because we're crazy. Should I tell her the real reason? If she were going to be there for me from now on, maybe we would end up searching for a real D sword in the future, and it might be better to say it all here and now.
これは偽物だけど。
But is it really a replica? Because it looks nothing like the ones you were trying to go for.
本物があるんだ。
Of course the real thing is out there. For that sword.
本物？
Remy regarded me dubiously, tilting her head.
本物を持ってる人を僕知ってるんだ。2 2人いる同じ学校の女子。
I'm not sure if it's the best idea to tell Rimi their genders.
女子ね。
Yeah. Rimi seems like she would probably kill you if you were dating her and she caught you even just hanging out with other girls that are just friends. She would probably kill you. She just seems like she's that kind of crazy, I'll be honest. She's an airhead, but I feel like she's also probably a little crazy.
女の子がこんなおもちゃを欲しがるかな。
本当なんだ。
Theirs are, of course, imaginary, and they pull it out of this void space type thing that exists, evidently.
それにおもちゃじゃない。
The one we have is, though, I imagine. It's probably not even a real sword.
あ、ごめん。
Certainly not for $100, I'm sure.
本物は光るんだ。それにすごい存在感で。僕それを探してる。それさえ手に入れれば僕は救われるんだ。
救われるって。
And now she's thinking, God, I can't believe this guy that I'm maybe, possibly, technically, actually friends with is crazy. Rimi's face went blank as if she felt taken aback, but I was utterly in earnest. Besides, a D-sword would be a powerful source of support when it came to defying Shogun.
それで
I wanted to ask her to help me search for it, but when I thought about the possibility of her turning me down, I became scared and insecure and lost the ability to say anything at all. Lobbing the fake sword aside, I sat on the couch. I sighed and closed my eyes. Maybe Rimi would offer to help me look for it of her own accord. If so, I'd give her my okay ASAP. Although it certainly wasn't realistic to expect that much. It was just that up until now, Rimi had emerged in front of me whenever I was in a pinch, as though she'd heard the voice of my heart, as though she were riding in on her white horse. And so, maybe...
とにかく、もし本物があったとしても、それこそ買ったりしちゃダメだよ。今タクが持ってるのはおもちゃだからいいけど、本物ってことは銃刀法違反になっちゃうんだから。
But Rimi, it's fine. The one we're looking for is imaginary. It doesn't exist. She instantly shattered my expectations. Ugh, I'm disappointed in you, Rimi. Well, no doubt her reaction was quite upstanding from the point of view of your average Joe. For these past few weeks, I'd run into all kinds of unexplainable things, and I'd been on the brink of believing everything Senna and Ayase told me. But perhaps my only choice was to search for the D-sword on my own, after all.
それでタク、
I sensed Rimi sat down next to me.
その本物の剣を持ってる女子って誰かな？
Of course she wants to know that detail. I heard her voice from close by. She was right beside me. The two of us, all alone in a dim, closed room. Moreover, we were sitting next to each other. It's a state of emergency. I've entered a state of emergency.
タクに女子の知り合いが私以外にいたなんてちょっとびっくり。もしかして彼女？
Do we seem like the kind of person who would have a girlfriend, considering we have a hard time interacting with real people in general, and, you know, even you? So we really are going to end up talking about that kind of thing. Could it be that Rimi was tempting me? The only conversation that could possibly develop from this topic was one about romance. And she'd say things to me that sounded rather like a confession, and then there'd start to be some real nice vibes between us. And are you gonna start playing what is it? The Beach Boys Grand Vibration, or not Grand Vibrations, Good Vibrations? No, I'm totally unprepared for this. I opened my eyes and frantically shook my head. Both Ayase and Senna were mysterious beings, and both of them were weirdos, but in a cute, eccentric way. I'd have moe'd over them if they were 2D characters, but I couldn't moe over something 3-dimensional. Especially Senna. Simply talking to her made me cower. She seemed like she wouldn't have any qualms about using violence. If possible, I'd want to avoid getting tangled up with her.
そっか。ちょっと安心したかな。
It's a flag! Or maybe it's a trap. Who knows? We're gonna find out next time, because we're right about the approaching 46-minute mark, and I'd rather not these go for like an hour, realistically. I'm not interested in them going an hour. About 45 minutes is sort of my cutoff. But, you know, I'm not gonna let it stop in the middle of a, like, point, I guess would be the best way to describe it. So, you know, a delusion like this, or one of those transitions that we get either for the end of a chapter, or I guess part of a chapter, would be the best way to describe the other type of transitions, are, in my opinion, decent cutoff points. So this is going to be where we cut off this part. I will see you all next time. Quick reminder that I do have a Discord and a Patreon. If you want to stay up to date on what is going on with the channel, I do highly recommend that you join my Discord, because that is my go-to place for posting about any potential interruptions to my recording schedule, to my streaming schedule, which is something I've gotten into more recently, as well as, you know, any, well, that's basically it realistically. But yeah. As for the Patreon, if you find yourself enjoying this series or any of the other content that I upload onto the channel, that is probably the easiest and best way to support the channel if you wish to go ahead and do so. But yeah, so I will see you all next time. But until then, goodbye and farewell.